Crawford. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture, which is just up the road. And I want to start by thanking, first of all, the Institute and the program in Political Philosophy, Policy, and Law, otherwise known as the PPPPPPL, and the Institute of Humanities and Global Cultures for putting this on. Before I forget, there's going to be a reception right afterwards. I'm not sure where, but we'll find the alcohol. Oh, there is no alcohol, actually. Sorry about that. We were denied. So Adam Sandel received his DPhil degree from Oxford in 2013, and has written this book called The Place of Prejudice, A Case for Reasoning Within the World. And that's what he's going to be talking about with us today. Adam sent this book to me, and I've had a chance to read most of it, and I think it's an extraordinary book. A very ambitious work of philosophical anthropology is what I would call it. I don't know if you would call it that. That I think really succeeds in its ambitions. So I will say no more, and please welcome Adam Sandel.
It's a pleasure to be here, to have the opportunity to talk about my book. I also want to thank Joe Davis for his hospitality and for arranging my visit, for inviting me to speak here about my book, The Place of Prejudice, A Case for Reasoning Within the World. So, the book is about prejudice, but not in the sense that we typically think of. By prejudice, I don't mean hatred and bigotry, attitudes that we rightly condemn, but prejudice in a broader, more old-fashioned sense, that of predisposition or prejudgment. By prejudice, I mean the background understandings and assessments that we bring to bear on all sorts of judgment, whether we're trying to decide who to vote for, how to act in a given circumstance, how to even interpret a novel or a movie. Now, we can surely escape the influence of certain prejudices, those of which we're aware and recognize as unjustified. But can we escape prejudice altogether? Is it possible, in other words, to judge with a completely open mind? A mind unoccupied by prejudgments and preconceptions of any kind. And furthermore, whether or not it's possible to judge free of prejudice, should we at least try as best we can to do so? Is the ideal of judging free of prejudice a worthy one? Although we tend to recognize the influence of prejudice, that we all have our prejudices of one kind or another, the ideal of judging free of prejudice has, I think, a very strong appeal. So let me give a few examples that I think help illustrate why. Take the grading of student papers. Some teachers and professors prefer to grade papers without knowing the names of the students who wrote them. They prefer to grade blind because knowing the names of the students invites prejudice. Perhaps you formed an unfavorable impression of some student. You think he's lazy and inattentive. But you don't want that negative impression to bias your grading of his paper. You want to avoid the temptation of giving him a lower grade than he deserves. blind grading as an attempt to eliminate prejudice seems to be quite fair. So here's another example from my favorite sport, baseball. And since the World Series is just finished, I'm sort of starved for baseball, so I'd like to discuss baseball a little bit more. Umpiring, calling balls and strikes. We expect umpires to be fair and objective, but we also know that they're prone to some biases. Favoritism, for example, toward big-name pitchers. According to a study conducted by 2 business school professors, umpires tend to call strikes on pitches outside of the strike zone 16% more frequently for all-star pitchers than for everybody else. So wouldn't a uniform strike zone enforced by high-speed camera technology, they suggest, make for a more objective, less controversial game? You know, this is the K-zone that's displayed often on ESPN or Fox that shows actually where the pitch is and is determined by a high-speed camera. So wouldn't this improve the game of baseball, these 2 people suggest? A third example, jury selection. Judges in most states are instructed to dismiss from jury duty anybody who's formed a prejudgment of the case, or anyone who, because of his background, is predisposed perhaps to one side or the other. So if you've been involved, for example, in a rent dispute, and the case at hand concerns a rent dispute, you would likely be dismissed from jury duty. And the idea is that, you know, this eliminates prejudice. And it seems, on the face of it at least, to be a just measure. It seems to select a jury that will consider only the facts presented in the case and nothing else. These 3 examples help us identify, I think, the appeal of judging free of prejudice. Even if in some cases we can't so easily rid ourselves of all prejudice, we should at least try. We should try to be prejudice-free for 2 reasons. First, prejudice leads to error. When we're influenced by prejudice, we assign the wrong paper grade, make the wrong call, render the wrong verdict. Second, prejudice leads to unfairness. These mistakes we make also do a sort of injustice to someone. When our bad impression of a student leads us to assign his paper an unduly low grade, we err not only from the standpoint of accuracy or truth, but also from the standpoint of fairness. Same with calling a generous strike for an all-star pitcher. By expanding the strike zone for the all-star pitcher, we do an injustice, arguably, to the unknown rookie pitcher, whose pitches might be in exactly the same location, but get called balls. So that prejudice is at odds with both truth and fairness, science and morals, lies beneath the prejudice-free ideal. But is this ideal as worthy as it seems? Actually, I think it isn't, and that's the thesis of my book. Not only is escaping prejudice impossible, but the very attempt to escape prejudice is misguided. Now, I want to return at the end to these 3 examples. Because actually, I think that blind grading, mechanical umpiring, and even the effort to find jurors without preconceptions leads to bad judgment. But before I give my view about these issues, I want to say something of the philosophical background to the prejudice-free ideal. By examining that background and by questioning it, we'll be in a better position to see what's wrong with our various attempts to escape prejudice today. The prejudice-free ideal arose during the Enlightenment, really just before, in the 17th century. Before then, prejudice was actually a technical legal term that carried no negative connotation. It meant simply a prejudgment rendered by a jury before all the facts had been considered. And the prejudgment, which of course could be revised, was supposed to help the jury take stock and to prepare for the rest of the case. During the Enlightenment, however, prejudice became a pejorative. It came to denote the most deep-seated and pervasive sources of error in our judgment. The distorting influence, for example, of tradition, habit, custom, upbringing. The two philosophers who really initiated this conception of prejudice were Francis Bacon and René Descartes. And their notion of prejudice was based on a larger understanding of the world, what we might call the subject-object dualism. According to this dualism, inside the mind, or the subjective consciousness, are perceptions of the world and ideas about it. Outside lies the world itself. The task of thought is to align our subjective representations of the world with the world as it really is. Now, the problem is that most of our subjective representations, even the ones we habitually take to be true, may not be. They may be mere prejudices, idols of the mind, as Bacon famously called them. Chief among the idols, says Bacon, is our tendency to believe about the world whatever we want to be true, to project our subjective values onto nature, or the world as it really is. We tend to believe that the world is beautiful, threatening, or useful. But different things look beautiful to different people. And even the same things, to the same people, can change with respect to their beauty. All such terms of value, Bacon concludes, reflect merely our subjective disposition, our prejudice. They do not define the world in itself. The birth of prejudice out of the subject-object worldview soon came to inform Enlightenment moral philosophy. People came to believe that the practices, traditions, and commitments that organize social life do not embody reason. They reflect merely the subjective valuations of individuals, which through blind habit and custom have eventually taken hold. An objective morality, whatever it might be, must be based on some standard outside the subjective desires of individuals. It must be impartial. The ethic of impartiality finds expression in Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. We should assess our motives, he says, from the standpoint of an impartial spectator. uncorrupted by our particular situation. Above all, says Smith, we should try to step back from our loyalties to family, friends, and country. Such loyalties, he argues, are merely the product of blind habit and custom. Our sympathy for brothers or for fellow citizens is born not of any rational identification with them, but simply of our being exposed to them more than to the rest of mankind. But such constrained sympathy, as Smith called it, is due to mere chance, to the accident of birth and social position, in deciding how to act, to whom we should direct our generosity, for example. We must correct the influence of habit by thinking as an impartial spectator, by asking ourselves how any reasonable person anywhere would allocate his resources. The ethic of impartiality, of which we see the beginning in Smith, comes to its fullest and most famous expression in the moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant. According to Kant, Smith's impartial morality isn't impartial enough. Although it rightly identifies habit and custom as sources of prejudice, it wrongly locates the desire for a prejudice-free standpoint in human nature, in fellow feeling, as Smith called it. Smith believed that the desire to act impartially comes ultimately from our innate sympathy for humanity at large. Kant vehemently rejects the idea that morality can be based on any feeling or natural inclination, no matter how widely shared. Morality must be based on pure reason alone. Reason untainted by anything unchosen or merely given, including tradition, habit, and custom, but also natural desire. Kant relegates all such influence to the category of prejudice. He thus articulates the truly prejudice-free moral philosophy, the ethic corresponding to the prejudice-free natural science of Bacon and Descartes. Just as our desire distorts our understanding of the world as it is, so, argues Kant, our desire distorts our understanding of the world as it ought to be. So we now have the full picture, or at least an outline of the full picture, in which our contemporary suspicion of prejudice appears to make a lot of sense. Here we see what we could call the prejudice against prejudice in its full expression. Our intuition that prejudice is at odds with both truth and fairness finds philosophical support in the subject-object worldview and its implications. So, what's wrong with the prejudice-free ideal? How can prejudice have a place, a legitimate place, in free, rational judgment? In judgment that's both true and fair. So that's the big question that I try to answer in my book. To ask what's wrong with the prejudice-free ideal is to ask what's wrong with the subject-object dualism. Now, because that dualism has become so ingrained in our way of thinking, it may seem to be self-evident. The idea that we receive information, first through our senses, about a world out there, and that that information may not correspond exactly to how the world really is, seems intuitively quite plausible. In fact, this way of thinking gives rise to the whole modern epistemological project. But what I think this subject-object picture misses is that the way in which we come to know things is not primarily by observing them, but by engaging with them in the various contexts of our lives. Attention to our everyday practical engagement with things, which doesn't involve a separation between oneself and the things with which one deals, leads us to rethink the place of prejudice. What if it turns out that the world first becomes intelligible from the practical perspective of our desires, purposes, and goals? So to find a place of prejudice along these lines, I turn to a philosopher who presents what I take to be the most compelling critique of the subject-object dualism. And that's the 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger. Now Heidegger is notoriously kind of difficult to understand, and he doesn't discuss prejudice all that much. But with exceptional philosophical rigor, he helps us think our way beyond the subject-object dualism. And if he's right about that, if he does help us think our way beyond this subject-object dualism, then there's good reason to believe that the case against prejudice is misconceived. One way of stating Heidegger's contribution, not only to the question of prejudice, but to philosophy more generally, is that he treats the subject-object perspective as merely one vantage point on the world. A vantage point that's actually far removed from our basic way of being and unnecessary for explaining how we come to know things. We relate to things and come to know them, not primarily as observers, but as participants. As a carpenter hammers at his bench, for example, he doesn't perceive the hammer as if he were a disengaged observer of it. He doesn't relate to the hammer as a thing with properties, or even as an object of conscious awareness. The more proficiently he presses the hammer into service and becomes absorbed in doing so, the more the hammer disappears from his perceptual range. In proportion to the hammer's disappearance is that of the carpenter's own self-consciousness, his first-person perspective. The I, or subject, disappears into the work he carries out. Absorbed in the flow of work, the carpenter and his hammer vanish into the activity of hammering. Although this activity has nothing to do with the subject related to an object, it's by no means a blind or mechanical absorption in one's environment. It has a point. Hammering is in order to nail a shingle to the roof. Nailing the shingle to the roof in order to build a house. Building a house for the sake of providing shelter. As oriented to a purpose, and ultimately towards some final goal or end in itself, the activity of hammering is a kind of understanding, a kind of situated or engaged understanding that has nothing to do with looking or inspecting theoretically. To know how to hammer well, in other words, is not to know a set of principles about hammers, but to be adept at the skill of hammering, knowing how to do it at the right time for the right purpose, ultimately in the context of one's life. Heidegger has a special term for this practical understanding. He calls it being in the world. The world, as Heidegger conceives of it, is the way of life toward which any purpose or goal ultimately points. A way of life, according to Heidegger, always expresses some comprehensive understanding of what it's all about, of the whole. Only from within this whole, this sort of lived story, argues Heidegger, can we encounter and understand any particular thing. The example of the hammer is meant to show that all of our sensory and intellectual awareness is a mode of our being in the world, a mode of our basic engaged and practical understanding. In short, there's no such thing as value-free, disengaged, objective knowledge. All understanding is self-understanding. But that's not to say that what we take to be knowledge is merely subjective. We can legitimately speak of things as they really are. But those things are inseparable from our interpretation of them. An interpretation which lies ultimately in our way of life, in our world. Now, if Heidegger is right, if all understanding is a mode of our being in the world, then there's really no prejudice-free standard of judgment after all. All judgment involves a prior understanding of the matter that we judge. And this prior understanding always involves some grasp of how best to live. We can now see why the project of banishing prejudice is arguably misconceived. The task of reason is not to separate our subjective prejudice from the world out there as it really is, independent of all prejudice, but rather to separate our prejudice that distorts the matter at hand from our prejudice that may illuminate it. So, with this in mind, let's return to the initial examples that I gave. Blind grading. I admit that it holds a certain appeal, and I've been tempted myself to be harsher on papers written by students who are perpetually distracted in class, or whose cell phones are always ringing. And that's not quite fair. If I were to be influenced by that prejudice, that would be wrong. It would be a prejudice that I would say is somewhat misplaced. But still, I don't grade blind. And I don't because I think it would deprive me of prejudice or background understanding that actually enables me to judge more fairly. I find it a lot easier to understand a student's paper when I know where it's coming from, when I can place it within the context of the student's prior papers, and especially within the context of the student's participation in the classroom discussions. Now, we could make arguments on both sides, for and against blind grading. And my point is not so much to settle the issue as to point to the kind of argument that we would have to make, whatever side that we take. The argument can't just be that blind grading is fair and objective, whereas non-blind grading is subjective and biased. Both kinds of grading involve a certain... No. Both kinds of grading involve a certain incontestable interpretive framework that comes with its own prejudices. But what we have to decide is what prejudices are the right ones. So what about calling balls and strikes? As a fan, I've been, tempted to demand a review on high-speed camera as I'm watching the games, and I see a pitch that's called a ball when I really think it should be called a strike. But actually, I think that such a review would be a bad thing for baseball, although it would eliminate the problem of umpires favoring big-name pitchers. And that might be a good thing. It would also eliminate the umpire's nuanced expansions and contractions of the strike zone that I would argue actually make for a better game. So, for example, when the pitcher is constantly pounding the outside corner of the strike zone, the umpire will often, little by little, gradually expand the strike zone to reward that pitcher's pinpoint accuracy. And I think that that's a good thing, that it rewards the excellence of baseball, the tremendous skill of baseball at its best. And if the pitcher, for example, is throwing a no-hitter, it heightens the drama of the game. Now, there could still be a case for replacing the umpire with a high-speed camera, though actually not many baseball fans have proposed it. But those who would propose it couldn't simply argue that the high-speed camera represents the objective, prejudice-free strike zone, and that traditional umpiring is subjective and biased. Both conceptions of umpiring draw upon a certain prejudice, a certain contestable understanding of what counts as good baseball. So lastly, and most importantly, jury selection. You don't want somebody on the jury who's the defendant's brother. And we also don't want somebody who's prejudged the case in such a way that he's not even willing to consider any of the facts. But do we want somebody on the jury without predispositions or preconceptions of any kind? Consider a 1990 obscenity case against a Cincinnati art museum and its director for displaying the allegedly obscene photographs by the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe. In an effort, it seems, to purge the jury of all prejudice, the judge dismissed from duty not only anybody who had seen the controversial exhibit, and not only anybody who had gone to the Cincinnati Art Museum, but anyone who claimed to be a fan of art, or who claimed to have gone to art museums frequently. Among the jurors selected was somebody who had never gone to museums. Now, clearly such a jury isn't prejudice-free. It's biased in its own way. And you might say it's filled with jurors so ignorant of the case and its context that they would have very little basis for judging what kind of art belongs in museums. So what all of these examples show is that escaping prejudice is impossible. But I also want to make the stronger claim that escaping prejudice isn't even desirable. That certain prejudices can actually enable good judgment rather than hinder it. And that the question we have to ask in all cases of judgment is not how do we get rid of our subjective prejudice in order to analyze the objective world as it really is, but rather, does our prejudice, at least to the extent that we're aware of it, illuminate or distort the matter that we're asked to judge? And this question, I would suggest, applies not only in the classroom or on the baseball field or in the courtroom, but in all realms of judgment. And in my book, I discuss historical study, social and natural science, philosophy, and moral judgment, all of which I would welcome questions on. In all of these realms or domains of judgment, I would suggest prejudice has its place. Thank you.
Objective and subjective judgments. That seems to me to be the right move to make. I'm not totally convinced you need Heidegger to make it, but I'm willing to give you that if you want. So that part I'm enthusiastic about. What I'm less enthusiastic about is the decision to then expand the category of prejudice to cover a large number of forms of judgment that seem to me to be actually very different from each other and worth distinguishing in important ways. So as you were talking, I had a list of 11 things that you mentioned along the way. There are working hypotheses, pragmatic rules of thumb, conceptual frameworks, habits, being engaged in skillful practices in a way that leads you to, lose yourself in absorption. There are forms and ways of life. There's value-impregnated perception. There's interpreted perception. There is useful, relevant background information that might be relevant to particular cases, like in the case of a student or a doctor making a judgment. And then simple biases of one kind or another. Actually, I don't think that biases are all just the same, but that may actually just be 10. I think I concatenated 2 on my list there. But why do we want to congeal all of these into one thing called prejudice? That doesn't strike me as useful. It strikes me as, if you really want to go all the way with getting rid of this bad discourse, and I'm with you with that, then let's replace this unhelpful term prejudice, reserve it for the standard cases of bigotry and zealotry, where and jurors who go in already knowing that he's a born liar and he's going to be convicted. And then, having hived it off to a useful place in our discourse, leave space for these rather more discriminating and helpful categories.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, and the reason I understand that the term prejudice might be somewhat misleading, and it's misleading because we tend to think of prejudice today as a negative thing. As I said at the beginning, we associate it with unjustified discrimination, hatred, contempt. But the reason that I use the term prejudice rather than something like background understanding or prejudgments, which as I take it, you would agree are necessary for good judgment, is that during the Enlightenment, prejudice was understood in quite a capacious way by thinkers like Bacon and Descartes, Adam Smith, and especially Immanuel Kant, who defines Enlightenment. This is Kant speaking. Not my interpretation of the Enlightenment, but Immanuel Kant defines Enlightenment as the emancipation from prejudice generally. So it's that sense of prejudice that Immanuel Kant highlights that I kind of want to pick up on and argue is essential to the way that we think about the world, reason about the world, make judgments. And for him, it is this very capacious category that includes something like everything except our pure practical reason in his terms. So habit, custom, tradition, our upbringing is all relegated to the category of prejudice, namely the unchosen or the given. So I entirely agree with you that when I say I'm defending prejudice or trying to find a place for prejudice, that sounds a little bit strange and why couch it in those terms, but it's partly a rhetorical tactic that I think is actually informative to the extent that Enlightenment thinkers, according to their own self-understanding, like Immanuel Kant, use the term prejudice as sort of the opposite of reason. So I want to call into contrast that distinction. And by prejudice, basically, and I know you said that, perhaps you don't need Heidegger to do this, although I think he offers one of the most compelling accounts of this. But by prejudice, I mean it in kind of the most comprehensive sense as our life perspective, as the comprehensive perspective shaped by our particular habits, customs, and traditions, but irreducible to any one of them, or even to the totality of them all. Something like the perspective from which we view the world, of which our particular loyalties are all parts that may or may not inform us in a given circumstance. But that's why I call my book The Place of Prejudice, even though prejudice, sounds like such a bad thing, and I'm perfectly willing to admit that there are certain prejudices that we should try to overcome that are bad prejudices that hinder our understanding of the world and our judgment. But I try to kind of take this Kantian, broadly Enlightenment sense of prejudice and give it a positive spin. And Gadamer, the philosopher Hans Georg Gadamer, did this, and I'm kind of following in that tradition, but that's kind of my thinking. Yeah.
So I'm in complete sympathy with your argument, but I want, it sounds very, it echoes, let's say, the arguments of someone like Michael Polanyi. I haven't read your book, but I did quickly look through the bibliography and index, and I don't see Polanyi mentioned. But part of what makes Polanyi interesting for me is because he's addressing many of these arguments. He even uses the illustration of the hammer.
Mm-hmm.
But he's doing it in the context of trying to understand objectivity in science. But he's also trying to obliterate that distinction between subject and object.
Yeah.
Does your argument, if you're familiar with Polanyi, do you take issue with him? Are you aligned with him? How do you see your argument in light of some of that other work?
Yeah, good question. Unfortunately, I haven't studied him extensively, but I know enough about his thought to know that it's very congenial to my way of thinking. So yes, that it's my situated account of understanding is very much in line with Polanyi's, and I think I could benefit a lot from reading what he has to say.
So the story with science is that it is, so on the one hand, he has this argument against that we can somehow achieve a prejudice-free understanding of the world. And yet scientists are, by virtue of their vocation, required to be objective or fair, or try to at least contain any kind of personal prejudices. So he's trying to find that space. What does it mean then for the scientists, for communities of scientists who bring to bear all of their different cultural backgrounds to the practice of science itself? And I wonder if you could just talk then a little bit about science.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as I say, Polanyi is someone who I'd be very interested to read more. And the guy who I actually turn to for an account of what you could call the prejudice or the fundamental preconceptions of modern science is actually Immanuel Kant. Now, in my presentation, I described him as kind of on the other side, as the enemy of prejudice, at least in his moral philosophy. But actually, he gives, I think, what today is still one of the most compelling accounts of the necessary presuppositions of modern physics. And Kant was primarily concerned with the Newtonian physics that was developing during his day, but his fundamental insight was that this new physics doesn't simply describe the world as it is, independent of our subjective consciousness, but rather the world as it was understood by Newton is already structured by this conceptual framework imposed by the subject who knows. So, for example, the idea that for every change or alteration in the world as we can perceive it, there is a prior cause, according to Kant. That principle is what he calls a synthetic a priori principle, or a sort of subjective prejudice that structures the objective order. So he's trying to collapse the distinction between subject and object, and that the orientation to seek out causes for events is not, is the condition of modern science, is the condition of modern Newtonian physics. Of course, the notion of a cause isn't something that we can derive from experience. We can't just look at constant correlations in the world around us and derive from those instances some idea of causality, as David Hume pointed out. But Kant, in contrast to David Hume, drew a very different conclusion. Kant said that actually the category of causality in that sense is the condition for the possibility of our empirical study of the world and orients us, orients natural science. And I see Kant in that respect, even still today, as kind of the thinker who most rigorously articulates the fundamental conceptual presuppositions of our understanding of action that one simply conducts or engages in is a separate question. And I think in the case of Heidegger, what he wants to say is that our kind of most basic level of understanding is this sort of implicit awareness exemplified by things like the skill of hammering, where we're not actually explicitly or consciously aware of the things with which we deal. And of course, those things with which we deal link up through a set of relations with an understanding of our world, or in other words, an understanding of how best to live the good life, and that understanding of how best to live in each and every case is practical and implicit for the most part, but that it bubbles up to our conscious awareness in certain circumstances, especially those in which something doesn't quite go right and we have to figure things out. And I don't take Heidegger as at all denigrating or disparaging our explicit awareness of things and our capacity for deliberation and philosophy. I mean, after all, he was a philosopher, and philosophy is a kind of explicit engagement with things, an attempt to make sense of something by means of concepts. It's a kind of explicit awareness. What I understand Heidegger is saying is that that kind of explicit awareness always rests on a sort of implicit background that we never can know or explicitly be aware of, but must nevertheless presuppose in order to make sense of our explicit awareness. And we have a sort of divination of this implicit background in moments when, say, we make sense of some situation, give a philosophical account of it, but have that account fall short or be totally unintelligible to somebody from another totally different context. And what that shows is that our account is really one that makes sense among friends in the sort of ancient Greek sense or Aristotle's sense, that philosophy is only possible among friends, among people who share a way of life, and that to understand the meaning, the weight of concepts and of accounts that we might give of our actions and intentions requires that we share some sort of way of life that we can that we must presuppose, but that we're never explicitly aware of. But I don't take Heidegger as saying that we can assign any limits to our ability to become explicitly aware of things, or our ability to do philosophy, that the situated character of understanding actually undermines the notion that we can assign any limits to our understanding. Does that sort of answer what you're getting at?
I think so. I would just say that you said two things. You said we can't be aware of the background knowledge, and that Heidegger doesn't want to assign limits to what we can be aware of. I think it's the latter point, really. It's that maybe we can bring certain features of our background practical understanding into view. It's just that we can't bring it all into view from some perspectiveless vantage point or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I always look at Aristotle's ethics as kind of the guide here, kind of a golden standard, where you have these really insightful accounts of the particular virtues of what counts as a brave action. So, for example, to risk your life in the battlefield out of utter despair isn't really bravery, Aristotle says, because what you're really doing is avoiding some pain. You're not fighting and risking your life for the sake of something noble. It's like you've got your back against the wall. And that can't count as bravery. So what matters, or one of the things that matters, is the end for which you're fighting, and that you not fight and risk your life out of a sense of despair. And he goes through all of these accounts, all of these sort of rules of thumb that really bring into view the phenomenon of bravery, what counts as a brave action. But at the same time, those accounts necessarily rely on particular examples that are only really intelligible to somebody who shares a way of life in which those examples make sense, or who shares a way of life in which those examples are at least relevant analogies, so that there's this kind of irreducible, situated understanding at play, even in our best accounts, most philosophically sophisticated accounts. And I see Heidegger as articulating precisely that. Yes, Jay.
Yes, Adam, thank you. It's all very interesting. I think I would ask you to reflect a little on the implications of your argument for institutions. I mean, we've sort of talked about politics, but I think increasingly, if you use particularly government institutions, which in a way have advanced to the farthest degree, perhaps, an imposition of regimes that try to eliminate prejudice, for very good reasons, but acquire a kind of logic of ongoing and perfecting of this eradication of prejudice to the point where even the ethos of the organization or institution is threatened in precarious ways. Do you think you could be able to make an argument about how one, in a sense, looks for the sort of healthy containment of prejudice, but again requiring a sense of its value and power and necessity, and then a sort of a point beyond which you need to allow for prejudice. That prejudice is essential if the ethos of an organization, if it's making certain objects, if it's producing some kind of knowledge, if it's doing journalism, is threatened if prejudice is denied.
Yeah. So journalism is an interesting example. Do you have any other particular institutions?
Well, could you say universities? Could you say, that's where we are now. But I think human resource schemes and in all kinds of organizations rightly set out to limit prejudice.
Yeah.
Is there a point at which this quite worthwhile and good project acquires a kind of logic that militates against other sorts of goods, including the good of the organization? The military, this would be a very telling example, I think, that in the military itself, and that there is now a very active social debate about women in combat roles. And you know, again, is that, do you think that the lens of prejudice is a useful one in thinking about, let's take the military.
Yeah.
The ethos of the military being something quite clearly defined. Is there a point at which the eradication of prejudice challenges the organization in fulfillment of its purpose or end?
Yeah, certainly. I think, yeah, the military is an interesting example. I haven't thought about it all that much as I understand the debate. The idea that women shouldn't serve in the front lines is based really on two ideas. One of them is related to men, that women will be distracting to men in combat, and that the discipline of the military requires a sort of separation of the sexes. The other reason seems to be what you could call a paternalist reason, and I don't mean that necessarily as a pejorative, although this particular instance you might say is misplaced, that that men have a sort of paternal duty to take on the burden of defending their country and risking their life, whereas women should be spared of that and should occupy other arguably equally valuable social roles, but different ones. And so I think both of those reasons are at play in the question of whether women should serve in the military or be on the front lines. And both of those, you could say, are certain contestable viewpoints, certain prejudices. And then, of course, the case in favor of women serving is that, well, they can be just as capable as men, especially depending on the particular role that they have in the military. And I would understand that debate in terms of prejudice and the competing prejudices or preconceptions of what counts as a good officer, and that we would have to sort out that question. So I do think that, first of all, it's a very difficult question. I haven't thought about it deeply enough to weigh in myself, but I see a compelling case on both sides.